I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We are covering the rest of the Milner-Fabian text, the text that gets into the history of the CFR, the history of the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, all of these globalist institutions that exist that are running our world, setting our policy, which came to the forefront, especially in the last 3 years, given the COVID and that whole false narrative. We were basically put under the directive of international institutions telling us what we have to do in terms of our daily lives, telling us how we have to be transitioned into the next phase, according to the lockstep document of the Rockefeller Foundation from 2010, the next phase of the Great Reset business plan. It's a business plan that's rolled out in phases, in successive stages, requires big catalyzing events to bring us to that next phase. Of course, 9/11 was a huge catalyzing event for the past 20 years. We're about, 20-ish years, 22 years past 9/11. We just seen the new 9/11, the slow motion 9/11 of the COVID narrative and the rollout of the bioweapon vaccines or experiment. It's not actually a vaccine. You know what I mean. Well, how do we get to that? What is the history of all that? And what's the next phase? What do we expect to come? That's what we're going to talk about today. And we can't just think about politics as really the only sphere that drives society and drives culture. Religion drives culture. Literature, media, the arts drive culture. Business actually drives culture. Money, monetary policy, finance, all of these things drive culture. And what we learned from the last century, and even going back into the 1890s, is that people like the Fabian socialists, the revolutionary Marxists, they had figured out that you can actually steer and create culture for control. And one of the things that was pointed out in the Ratio Milner-Fabian book that I hadn't really thought about as a person who studies the history of culture creation is that if you think about the post-war period, whether post-World War I, where they really experimented with what I'm getting at, it's actually post-World War II where the psyops were rolled out to a degree that had never been seen before. And this involves the reconstruction of post-war Germany, post-war Japan. These societies were actually tested with high-level psychological warfare operations on the part of the Allied powers. Now, I'm not saying that makes the Axis powers the good guys, where we always think in these very controlled, managed dialectics. In my view, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War were essentially high-level controlled dialectics. And they were controlled by the deep industrial power base and the deep finance power base that is essentially identical to what we call the Anglo-American Establishment. And so that establishment, in my view, as Dr. Carroll Quigley says, arranged these two world wars and the Cold War. And they did that because they had a long-term goal, a long-term plan, which would be the reorganization of society, including church, state, the world, commerce, the economy, and even business itself, to go under something that would be completely new, completely different than had ever been seen in the history of the world. There had been predecessors to this position, to this worldview, like Plato's Republic, but that had never been instantiated. Plato's Republic is the seminal form of a technocracy, even though technology, right, was in a very primitive, nascent form at that time. Now that technology has come to full fruition, these elites believe that they can put us under a fully idealistic utopian socialist project, which requires the mass killing off of most of the earth, mass depopulation. So we'll get to that in a moment. We want to look at how church, education, the state, business, economy, everything has to be revolutionized. All these areas are being changed. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We're discussing the history of psychological operations and social engineering to change entire cultures, and how post-war civilization, post-war Europe became a primary testing ground for how to perfect this technique. And the CFR, the OSS, and the CIA and other culture-creating organizations were heavily involved in post-war Europe in terms of not just the creation of the EU, the common market, all of these types of supranational institutions. They were actually involved in testing out new techniques for how to engineer societies to go against what had been their traditional approach. For example, in Germany, post-war Germany, the OSS and the CIA, via the CFR, had had put into place a lot of programs to re-educate post-war Germans into becoming an agrarian society to deindustrialize Germany, because of course Germany was the central powerhouse of Europe prior to World War II. And so this allowed a lot of experimentation with the Morgenthau Plan, and a lot of experimentation with re-engineering that society to teach what we might call neoliberal values to change that society. Now, it's not just Germany, it's also other test bed areas. And I've argued, if you go back to my previous 4th Hours, where we did a whole analysis of Douglas Valentine's book on Vietnam, and how Vietnam was an exercise not really in fighting communism. That was maybe one level of this, but it was also a mass reorganization of populations experiment. It was a mass reorganization and re-education experiment. So while it's true that re-education camps is something that we think of as a communist thing, it's not exclusive to communists. Cecil Rhodes actually invented the slave labor camp, and this would be used later on in places like Bolshevik Russia, where they would have re-education of gulags. All of that is a model that was kind of pioneered by De Beers / Cecil Rhodes's diamond mine empire. And that was something set up by Lord Milner and Lord Rothschild to essentially expand the British Empire. And by expanding and testing out certain techniques of corporate control, which included slavery, not just racial slavery, but slavery in general for wage slavery, that same model gets exported to other countries as a test experiment for corporate control. Did you know the Bolshevik Revolution was really run out of London and New York? We've lectured through all of Anthony Sutton's books, and it was done for the purpose of the advantage of certain corporations, particularly the American Industrial Corporation at that time, other entities connected to J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller interests, other bankers as well. That allowed for experiments in not just reorganizing society, but the new ways to create essentially private labor, private slave labor. We see the same thing with private industrial prison complex labor nowadays. It's the same model. It's just now done in terms of the state prisons, which are actually private prisons. That's the same principle of slave labor. And that same model is now what we're seeing. Now Jordan Peterson is supposed to go to re-education camp now, they're saying, right? I mean, this is crazy, right? But this is not just a communist idea. It's also a monopoly capitalist idea utilized by socialists and communists. And now with the new model that we're going into of the corporate capitalist socialist mix system that we're going into known as technocracy, all of those elements are coming into play. But it's really crucial to understand that this was perfected to a scientific degree in the post-war period with the reconstruction plans in terms of World War II. And it didn't stop with World War II post-war reconstruction plans, the Schuman plan, the EU plan, all of those things were reconstruction plans coming out of the post-war plans, right, of the reconstruction of Europe into the European Union, which it turns out was actually a Milner-Fabian creation as well. It wasn't actually, there was a German plan for that, but a lot of people think it was a German plan. It was actually a Milner-Fabian socialist London plan together with the American power elite. It was not mainly a German plan. There were some German socialists who also favored the idea of the creation of the EU. But all of these institutions go back to the same structure that I've been talking about and lecturing through for the past few weeks here on the 4th Hour. And if we don't understand that, we're never going to understand that all of these institutions have the same origin, all the institutions today. And that helps prove and demonstrate that we're going through 100+ year plan. It's a strategy. It's not a bunch of idiots running things. There's a layer of idiocy. Okay, it's like a cake. Okay, and there's like the devil is at the center of the cake, and then you got a layer of really smart people around him, right? High-level demons. And then you got a layer, it's like a layer cake of idiocy, right? Well, the layer of idiocy protects the really nefarious, malicious people in the inner core of the cake. But most people can't penetrate beyond that. Oh, Biden, they're all a bunch of idiots. They're incompetent. The layer of incompetency protects these people. Where does Klaus Schwab come from? Did he just pop up and create Davos? No. He was recruited via Kissinger for a special society out of the Harvard Research Project run by the CIA. And that was to create another kind of layer of this giant devil cake, you could say, right? He's another layer of this cake, which is the public face of Bilderberg. That's why he used to be part of Bilderberg steering committee, right? I think he was ahead of it at one point. And who set up all that? Well, it was a conglomeration of Fabian socialists, SS members like Prince Bernhard, David Rockefeller, and members of the Milner, Fabian, Rothschilds, Rhodes, Milner, or Cliveden set circles. Right? That's who set up all of these institutions. In fact, the EU is really a creation of Bilderberg, which is the inner group that I'm talking about. Right? That's these people. People like Churchill, for example. He was actually a stooge of these people. If you get into the real history of Churchill. And I'm not saying that makes all the British people bad. It's not the British people. It's not the American people. It's the elites that run these things at the CFR, at the World Economic Forum, at Bilderberg. That's who's really calling the shots. Fortune 500, Fortune 100. That's who's setting up Federal Reserve, setting up IMF, World Bank, United Nations. The United Nations is a successor to the League of Nations. And if you didn't know, Churchill was actually a Druid. Go look up the pictures of Winston Churchill at his famous Druid lodge, and Druids believe in worshiping the earth and, of course, getting rid of most of the people. Many of them do. So you can also get my books in the shop at my website. Go to jaysanalysis.com. You get access to my archives. If you sign up for the website, you can also get access to my material on Rockfin, which is a great free speech-based platform. Now, we were talking about culture creation and how this was done as a mass kind of experiment in the post-war period following World War II, and that this allowed then in the Cold War a lot of other theaters of war to become culture creation experiments. And a lot of those individuals involved in that culture creation, re-education, Psy-war techniques, then went from the OSS, not kidding, to being the heads of the major media outlets, the heads of the major networks. They all come out of the OSS, and people from the CIA. So they took that wartime psychological warfare information and scientific technique, and then they applied it to mass media. They also had control of most of the press at that time. All the big media outlets back in the 40s and 50s were already controlled by the very people that we've been talking about. So we're deep into this. This is not something that we just elect a few politicians and we're out of it. I'm not saying that you can't elect good politicians. You can, but we have to understand the real diagnosis of what the situation is. Right? If we don't understand the diagnosis, we don't accurately diagnose the problems, we're just going to be spinning hamster wheels and never solving anything. And that's precisely how this system actually works, is that you're constantly given false leads, false conservatives, fake right-wing people to follow, and then nothing ever gets fixed, nothing ever changes, because there's never an identification of the actual superstructure of how this system is run. And you're always kind of within a predetermined circle, learning and disagreeing and fighting over the daily news cycle, and you're never seeing the big picture. That's why I always try to focus on the big picture, because the daily news cycle is important, but it only really makes sense in terms of the bigger context, the bigger picture. You'll notice that when they developed the psyop of news, I'm talking about the local news and the newsman, the Tom Brokaw kind of barking at you about what you're supposed to think and all this, that they never gave you the big historic context. And that's what we try to do here, because we have to understand that this is not something that you can understand without a bigger paradigm. How are you going to fix these issues if you don't understand what the long-term plan is? And the fact that this long-term plan has been kept from the masses is precisely how it has been so successful up to this point. People just didn't know what technocracy was. People in colleges, universities, they're not taught about this until you get to like the highest levels of doctors, medical people, and international relations people, who are the people that they recruit into this stuff. That's it. There are other people that are not really involved in this. Maybe there's a couple philosophers who got recruited into this that are mentioned in Quigley's text, people like Isaiah Berlin, I think, people like Karl Popper, right? This is why Soros names his institution, the Open Society Institute. That's Karl Popper's book. So there's a handful of kind of high-level philosophical academics who've been recruited into this, according to Quigley, since in the 20th century. So there might be one or two academics, that are philosophers or whatever. But for the most part, this is people in international relations, people who are lawyers, people who are high-level CEOs, business people. That's who's recruited into this kind of stuff. And so they were already pulling information about this out of the libraries back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And if you go and look up the day tapes, this is a really important overlooked piece of research. There was a conference held in the late 60s under the Planned Parenthood organization of all the top doctors in the United States at that time. So this is the elite doctors, and they were all brought to this one location to be taught by the head of Planned Parenthood under the Rockefeller aegis that there's a plan to have enforced vaccinations of all Americans, to have a implantable chips or some kind of RFID tracking. At that time, it was pretty low tech, so now it's a lot more advanced with nanotech, right? There was a plan to increase through degeneracy and sexual control the complete changing of the moral landscape of American sexuality. That was all mentioned in this 1969 plan. Look up the New Order of Barbarians. The whole 4-hour lecture is on YouTube if you want to find that. And that lays out actually this whole conference's plans. Now, the reason we know about that is because one of those doctors that was there happened to be a Catholic, and he went to, in the 1980s, what they call the Pro-Life League. I don't know if it still exists anymore, but and then he leaked this, and so it's known as the day tapes. And I think a lot of people, kind of like the Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars documents, they probably thought this was something very speculative or a conspiracy theory, which might be plausible had we not gotten into a situation where now by 2023, most of the things mentioned in that have rolled out, right? I mean, who would have thought at that time that you would have, the push for things like universal basic income, the push for total technocracy, the push for changing your gender, all of that stuff was mentioned back in the late 60s in this document. Also look up the Berelson-Jaffe memo, which is also fostered by the Rockefeller Foundation as well. It's sent out to all the Planned Parenthoods, and it says the same thing: creation of technocracy, getting rid of having families, basically promoting every type of sexuality, not because of anything to do with freedom or liberty, but rather to do with the reorganization of society. So you have to understand that all of this makes perfect sense when we look at it from a psychological warfare, from a war perspective. It's warfare that's being waged. And culture and economic warfare are two elements of warfare that most people don't know about. People think of warfare as tanks and bombs and soldiers. No. That's old school. Okay. Warfare, especially in the 20th century, developed into economic warfare, developed into culture warfare, and the creation of toxic culture as a form of ideological psy-war. If you don't understand that, you'll never understand what's going on around you. You'll never understand that all of pop culture is basically toxic culture creation. It all comes out of MK Ultra. And it's just, and even myself, somebody who studies this all the time, I mean, it was new to me that I didn't even know about the post-war PSYOPs experiments in re-education in terms of the post-war Germany, post-war Axis powers. And then I didn't know about the Cold War experimentation in culture creation. So here we are every day, even we're learning new things come out, historians break new information. This is why history is so important. If we don't know history, we're doomed to repeat it. So what are the areas of society that this plan for 100 plus years, 120 years has been attempting to reorganize? All areas of society. The church is now being reorganized into, after the introduction of ecumenism, higher critical liberalism, and the idea of the social gospel, liberation theology. It is to turn the church not into an institution focused on repentance and belief in resurrection of Christ or this kind of stuff, but rather to turn it into an NGO or a tool of soft power. During the Cold War, with C.D. Jackson and the doctrinal warfare program of the CIA, which is now declassified, now well known. Look at David Wimhoff's book. Now that is a change from the promotion of Americanism to turning the churches into institutions of a new global religion. Pachamama, that kind of stuff. So that's the end goal of the world religion ecumenist movement now. Is its new phase, its next phase is to, as Aldous Huxley says in the Perennial Philosophy, create a new generic world religion where all the world religions blend into a giant blob. Education, right? Madame Blavatsky, Horace Mann, John Dewey, all of these socialists and theosophists, and many of the theosophists were, the theosophy is basically the creation of the Fabian Milner social circles as well, socialist circles. It's a Fabian socialist institution as well. They all said, let's change education to be not something where you learn to critically think, but you become the socialized cog in a giant system. So it's a socialization tool, public schooling in America, not a tool to create critical thinkers. The state becomes an engine of the march of God in history, as Hegel said. Hegel is the ultimate statist, right? And the technocratic state is a combination of Hegel and Plato. It's the idea of the state basically being the voice of God in history. And so it determines truth and falsehood. The corporate state. So I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We were talking about that process of history, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? We know that that's a technique of kind of manipulation and social control and psychological warfare techniques to manipulate with false dialectics and then present you with the synthesis, which is the solution to this manufactured thing. Well, for Hegel, it was something much more than that. It was actually the process of reality itself was in his thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and all of history is kind of working itself out to this, what he called an omega point, which is where all of reality would become God. And so he's very influential in certain ways to transhumanism. And his vehement critic, Nietzsche, was also influential for transhumanists because Nietzsche thought of the Übermensch, right? The overman would eventually emerge and kind of be beyond all limitations, beyond all morality, beyond good and evil. So there's kind of elements of all of these figures, as well as elements of Platonism in terms of technocracy that go into the overriding view of today's elites and where they're trying to take us. And Hegel's idea that we could evolve to the history itself would produce God, right? We've heard of people like Ray Kurzweil. I don't believe in God yet, right? Because God would be the thing that emerges from creation that is the sentient AI or whatever. And this is, again, very close to Hegelianism because the idea is that as we evolve to transhumanism, or as we evolve to what he called the omega point, all of reality becomes spirit, all of reality becomes self-consciousness, and is God. God in process coming to self-realization that all reality is God. I mean, that sounds crazy, but I mean, isn't that kind of what New Agers teach? Isn't that kind of what Eastern religions teach? And believe it or not, Hegel was actually involved in Hermetic secret societies. This is now confirmed. So there's a book, Hegel and Hermeticism. Now, again, I'm not saying that the world elites are, going and hiding in bunkers and reading Hegel, right? Very few people can read. I mean, he's almost unreadable. But that's his philosophy. That's his process philosophy that did influence a lot of people, and including people in the transhumanist movement. So if you have heard of Noah Yuval Harari and the way he speaks about things, and Klaus Schwab and Ray Kurzweil, they may not be self-conscious Hegelians, but they're definitely influenced by this train of thought, this dialectical process philosophy that is moving us towards transhumanism, or this belief that we can transcend time and space bodily limitations through technology. No, I think that's a pipe dream. I don't think you can actually achieve those things. Certainly technology can help us, but what I'm trying to get at is that these are real philosophical things that real power elites do believe and do get into. And if we don't understand their approach and their ideas, how could you ever go against this? You don't even know what you're fighting. So I was talking about the reorganization of societies, cultures, civilizations in every area of life. That's what you're up against. That's what we're up against. We're not up against political opponents. It's much wilder and crazier and far-fetched beyond anything like stupid politics debates, right? It manifests in politics, but it's much more than that. We're talking about the changing of religion everywhere and across the entire globe. We're talking about not necessarily the eradication of it, but turning it into a tool for global power structures for globalism. Religion as an NGO for globalism is what I'm saying. Education is purely socialization, purely indoctrination. That's it. The state is, as Hegel says, the march of God in history. Okay. And I'm sorry if you're a libertarian, that doesn't mean that it's a vindication of libertarianism. For libertarians, it's the private corporations that own the state. Now, I know many libertarians who believe in opposing monopoly corporatism, right, would agree with that, or monopoly capitalism. But it's much more than these older debates of, free market versus, centralization. It's way beyond that. We're talking about full-on post-industrial austerity, Great Reset, shutting down of everything. And that's why what you're hearing called for is not people that are stupid that want to shut down gas stoves. It's not dumb people who want to call to ban cars. They're not dumb people. They're a layer of dummies run by highly sophisticated psychological warfare and mad scientist elites. That's why they want death care, euthanasia. That's why they want the banning of cars, the banning of meat. This is warfare 101. Plato said you have to control the plebes and the people at the bottom of the pyramid, what they eat. You can't feed them meat, feed them grains, keep them weak, docile, fat, and dumb. The shutting down of travel, the shutting down of commerce. Okay, those are elements of freedom. Those are elements of sovereignty. Those are elements of you having power and self-sufficiency and independence apart from a global, super state. You can't have that in a global super state. And so they said 100 years ago, we'll have a universal basic income credit system. Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells said that 100 years ago. Okay, this is not something that Mark Zuckerberg dreamt up. It's not an invention of any Silicon Valley tech nerd. This is something invented by people 100 years ago, like Lord Birkenhead saying that we'll have babies in test tubes. In the 1930s, he said that. And he was one of the Lord Milner circles, one of the Cecil Rhodes roundtable people. Look up Lord Birkenhead's famous essay in Cosmopolitan magazine, where he says, save my essay because in 100 years, we'll start genetically engineering babies, bring them out of test tubes. We'll have a completely controlled technocracy. 100 years ago. That's the real plan. And I think the argument here is that if people aren't smart enough to go and read a freaking public essay and figure out that it's a 100-year-old plan, then the idea is that you deserve it. Now, I don't think that that's true, but we will be defeated if we don't wake up and understand that. I mean, how hard is it to go and look and see if Lord Birkenhead wrote an essay in the 20s or 30s in Cosmopolitan magazine about growing babies in test tubes in 100 years? There it is. Okay, there you go. It's a 100-year plan. He was one of the top elites in the circles of Milner, Cecil Rhodes, et cetera, et cetera. This is the type of thing that you read in Brave New World. Aldous Huxley is hanging out in the circles of these people. That's why he wrote the book. So, why can't anybody figure this out? It's like, and that's why they want to ban cars. That's why they want to ban stoves. That's why they want to have no families. That's why they want to have 15-minute cities, right? That's why they want to have death care, euthanasia. It's in all the sci-fi stories, Logan's Run, Soylent Green. That's why there's the Agenda 21 treaty, the Rio Bush Treaty, what they had planned for 2030. It's all in that as well. The UN Biodiversity Project, the Rewilding Project, all of those are real plans and projects for the shutting down of the existing system. Remember the CDC guy? He said, let's blow up the existing system to bring in the new medical system. And he said that before the COOF. So why are they letting all of this come out about, the stabbies and all that as the SPARS documents? Is because that's part of blowing up the existing system by design. It's a technique of warfare. And they're going to blame it, of course, on everybody else. So, it was, these low-level people. And it was your fault that it's everybody else's fault that the stabbies are doing this, right? Or they'll just say that it was a new, COVID-27 is going around and doing it. We didn't know it, but COVID-27 is causing people to have, cardiac arrest, blah, blah, blah. Those are, again, it's all just psyops. It's all just gaslighting. But the point is that this is all part of a bigger plan. you don't understand the bigger plan, none of this is ever going to be solved. It's not going to be stopped. So all you have to do is go read Lord Birkenhead's essay. It's not very long. And you can see it's a plan. It's not a plan that Klaus cooked up. It's not a plan history. It's not a plan that Henry Kissinger cooked up. In fact, it's not even a plan David Rockefeller cooked up, because he went and studied under these people. He studied under Harold Lasky at Harvard and at the London School of Economics. And that was set up by who? By the Fabian socialists, who wanted to align themselves, combine Marxism with big capitalism. That's their whole thing. That explains everything, doesn't it? It's a perfect explanation. It's a perfect way to understand what's going on now. And if we don't understand that, we're not going to fix it. So all of these institutions, all these global institutions, they have this as their origin. This is the origin. This is how to understand. This is a big, huge plan.